The sun was barely up when the old man left his small brick house on the edge of town. The air was still cool, and a light mist hovered over the road as he drove his faded blue sedan toward the grocery store. He wasn't in a hurry. He rarely was. His movements were calm and slow, the kind that came from years of patience and wisdom. The town was quiet that morning, the streets almost empty except for a few early risers heading to work. The old man hummed softly to himself, a tune from another time. The car's engine made a low, steady sound. He wore a clean shirt tucked neatly into pressed pants, his shoes polished though they were old. A small pin rested on his hat, the only thing that hinted at the kind of man he truly was. As he passed through Main Street, the light turned yellow, then red. He stopped, as he always did. While waiting, he looked out the window at the bakery, watching the owner set out fresh bread. He smiled faintly, remembering how his wife used to love the smell of that place. She had been gone for years now, but he still thought of her every morning. When the light turned green, he eased forward. A few minutes later, flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it must be an ambulance, but when he pulled slightly to the side, the vehicle behind him followed. He sighed softly and pulled over completely. The police car stopped behind him. He didn't know why. He hadn't been speeding, and he had just checked his taillights a week ago. Still, he stayed calm. He turned off the engine, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel. A young officer stepped out of the car, his sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. He walked slowly, almost like he wanted to make his presence known. The old man greeted him politely, his voice quiet and steady. But before he could finish his sentence, the officer cut him off. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp. The old man nodded and reached carefully into his pocket. "Yes, sir," he said softly. His movements were slow and respectful. The officer tapped the roof of the car impatiently. "You know why I stopped you?" "No, sir," the man replied calmly. "Was I speeding?" "Broken taillight," the officer snapped. "And you were swerving a bit." The old man looked puzzled. "I didn't notice, officer. I'll have that light checked right away." The officer studied him for a moment, then smirked. "Where you headed this early, huh?" "Just the store," the old man said simply. The officer looked over the car. It was old, worn, and clean, but clearly not new. "You sure this thing's roadworthy?" he said, half smiling, half sneering. "It's served me well for years," the old man replied, trying to keep the conversation respectful. The officer leaned closer, as if looking for something. "You got anything in the car I should know about? Weapons, drugs?" The old man blinked in surprise. "No, sir. Just groceries." The officer chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Stay right here," he said, walking back to his patrol car. The old man sat quietly, his hands still resting on the steering wheel. He could see people walking on the sidewalk across the street, a few glancing his way. He felt their eyes, and it stung a little, not because of what they thought, but because this was not the first time he had been looked at that way. The officer returned after a few minutes, still wearing that same smirk. "Everything checks out," he said, "but I'm going to need you to step out of the car." "Step out?" the old man asked gently. "Is something wrong?" "Just do it," the officer barked. The man sighed quietly and opened the door. His knees ached as he stood up, but he didn't complain. He faced the officer calmly, his back straight despite his age. "Put your hands on the hood," the officer said. The old man hesitated, confused. "Sir, may I ask why I said put your hands on the hood?" The man did as told, slowly placing his palms on the cool metal. The officer began patting him down, roughly checking his pockets. A few people had stopped now, watching from the sidewalk. Someone pulled out a phone and started recording. The old man's heart sank a little. He didn't like being the center of attention. He had lived his life trying to stay humble and kind. This public scene made him feel small, not angry, just deeply tired. After a few moments, the officer stepped back. "You can relax," he said dismissively. "You can go once I write your ticket." The man turned to face him. "Ticket for what, sir?" "Failure to maintain lane. Broken taillight. Maybe even resisting if you keep talking." The old man shook his head slowly. "I meant no disrespect, officer. I just didn't understand." The officer shrugged, writing quickly on his pad. "You people always say that," he muttered. The words hit the man like a slap, but he didn't respond. He simply stood there, quiet and dignified. He had faced far worse in his life, on battlefields in places where respect meant survival. This, compared to that, was nothing. Yet it still hurt. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Some were angry at what they were seeing. Others stayed silent. The officer seemed to enjoy the control he had, the way the moment belonged entirely to him. Finally, he tore the paper from his pad and handed it to the old man. "Next time, fix your car before you hit the road," he said coldly. The old man nodded. "I will, sir." "Good," the officer said, stepping back. "Now get going." The old man didn't move right away. He looked at the officer, not with hate, but with something else. A quiet disappointment, the kind that spoke louder than anger ever could. Then he opened his car door, sat down and adjusted his hat. As he did, the sunlight caught the small pin on it, a golden eagle with stars beneath it. The officer didn't notice. He had already turned away. The man started the engine and drove off slowly. The murmurs from the crowd faded behind him. He didn't look back. The drive home felt longer than before. His hands trembled slightly on the wheel, but his expression stayed calm. Every once in a while he sighed softly, as if letting go of a heavy thought. When he reached home, he parked the car in his usual spot and sat there for a long moment. The quiet of the neighborhood wrapped around him. Birds sang in the distance. He stared at the small flag that fluttered gently on his porch. It reminded him of promises made long ago, promises about freedom, respect, and equality. Promises that, after all these years, still felt incomplete. He got out of the car and walked slowly up the steps, his knees stiff, his mind heavy. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. He set the ticket on the kitchen table, then took off his hat and placed it beside it. For a moment, he stared at the pin, the symbol of his years in service. He remembered faces of friends who never made it home, the battles they fought, the fear they overcame, the honor they carried. And now here he was, treated like a criminal by someone who had no idea of the road he had walked. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window. Outside, children laughed as they walked to school. A delivery truck rumbled down the street. Life went on just as it always did. He sipped his coffee slowly and smiled faintly. There was no anger in him, just a deep sadness. Not for himself, but for how the world still struggled to see what truly mattered. Later that day, a neighbor stopped by and asked what had happened. The old man didn't tell the full story. He just said he was stopped for a light that wasn't broken. "It's fine," he said softly. "People act how they're taught. Maybe one day they'll learn better." He smiled gently, not because he was okay, but because he refused to let bitterness take root in him. When the neighbor left, the old man looked once more at the flag outside. The wind had picked up, making it wave proudly against the clear blue sky. He whispered to himself, "Some battles never end." And with that, he folded the ticket neatly and slipped it into a drawer. He didn't plan to fight it. He had fought enough in his life. But what he didn't know was that this small, quiet moment, this injustice he chose to meet with grace, would soon become something much bigger. Someone had seen everything. Someone had recorded it. And before long, the whole town would know exactly who that quiet old man truly was. The video of that morning's traffic stop began spreading quietly at first. A bystander who had filmed it uploaded it online, thinking people should see how unfairly the old man was treated. The clip showed everything. The calm voice of the old man, the sharp tone of the officer, and the way he was made to stand beside his car as people watched. Within hours, it was shared again and again. People commented that the man's patience and calmness were remarkable. Some were angry, others heartbroken. The officer's face was clear in the video, his attitude impossible to deny. But while the internet started buzzing, the old man went on with his quiet routine. He didn't know how far the video had gone, or how many people were now talking about him. That morning, he was sitting at the small table near his window, reading the newspaper, a habit he never missed. His cup of coffee steamed beside him, untouched for a while as his thoughts wandered. He wasn't thinking about the officer or the ticket. He was thinking about his late wife, how she would have scolded him for going out alone so early. She always worried, even when he told her he could handle himself. He smiled softly at the thought. His phone rang. It was his neighbor from 2 houses down. The man asked if he'd seen the video. The old man frowned. "What video?" he asked. The neighbor hesitated and said, You might want to sit down before you see it." A few minutes later, the neighbor came over, phone in hand. He played the clip for the old man. At first, the old man said nothing. He just watched himself on the small screen, standing by his car, quiet and patient while the officer's words filled the air. The crowd's murmurs, the tension, and it was all there. When it ended, the old man sighed. "So that's what everyone's talking about," he said softly. His neighbor nodded. "It's everywhere. People are upset. Some are calling the department. Reporters are even asking for your name." The old man looked out the window, thoughtful. "I didn't want any of this," he said. "I just wanted to buy bread," the neighbor said gently. "Maybe it's time people see what still happens, even to someone like you." The old man didn't answer right away. He just folded his hands together and stared at the sunlight on the table. After a moment, he spoke quietly. "Sometimes attention helps, but sometimes it only brings noise. I've had enough noise in my life." That afternoon, as he walked to his mailbox, 2 young men from the neighborhood stopped him. They recognized him from the video. One of them said, "Sir, I just want you to know you handled that better than I ever could have." "You didn't even raise your voice," the old man smiled faintly. "Raising my voice wouldn't have helped," he said. "Sometimes silence is stronger." They nodded respectfully and left him to his day. But more people started to notice him now. In the store, at the gas station, even while he was walking his dog. Some thanked him for setting an example. Others told him they were angry for him. By the evening, a local reporter showed up at his door. She was polite and careful with her words. "Sir," she said softly, "we'd like to share your side of the story. People want to know who you are." He hesitated. He didn't like attention, but he could tell the young woman was sincere. "There's not much to tell," he said. "I was stopped for something I didn't do. I stayed calm. That's all." "But you stayed calm in a way most people wouldn't," she replied. "That video's made a lot of people stop and think." He sighed. Maybe they should have been thinking long before this. The reporter asked if she could record a short interview. After a long pause, he agreed. They sat on his porch, the evening sun turning the sky orange. Her questions were gentle about what happened, how he felt, and whether he was angry. He told her, "I wasn't angry. I was disappointed. The world hasn't learned as much as I hoped it would." When she asked why he wasn't pressing charges or demanding an apology, he shook his head. "Because anger changes nothing. Respect is taught, not forced. I just hope that young man learns before life teaches him the hard way." The next morning, the interview aired on local TV. People watched as the calm, elderly man spoke with quiet wisdom. He didn't brag. He didn't accuse. He simply told the truth with grace. That grace was what made the story spread even faster. Soon, national outlets began calling the news station. Who was this man? What was his story? Why did he wear that pin on his hat? The reporter, curious herself, decided to do some digging. What she found stunned her. The man wasn't just an ordinary citizen. He was a decorated veteran. A former colonel who had led troops in difficult times and had earned several medals for bravery and leadership. He had served his country for decades, training young soldiers, saving lives, and earning the respect of everyone who ever worked under him. He had retired quietly years ago, never seeking attention or special treatment. Most people in town had no idea who he really was. He never talked about it. His medals were tucked away in a small wooden box in his closet, along with old photos from places far from home. The reporter decided to visit him again. When she arrived, she brought a folder of what she'd found: newspaper clippings, military records, and even photos of him standing beside high-ranking officers. When she showed him the papers, the old man looked surprised but calm. "You've done your homework," he said with a small smile. "Sir," she said gently, "why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" He looked down at his hands, thinking for a long moment. "Because who I was doesn't matter. Who I am does, and right now I'm just a man trying to live quietly." The reporter said, "But people deserve to know. You earned more than respect. You earned honor. That officer treated you like you were nothing, and he had no idea." The old man shook his head. "That's exactly it. He shouldn't need to know my past to treat me right. You don't respect someone because of their rank. You respect them because they're a person." Those words stayed with her long after she left. That night she wrote her article, not about the stop itself, but about the man behind it. She titled it, "The Veteran Who Chose Dignity Over Anger." When the story went live, it spread faster than anyone expected. News stations across the country picked it up. Social media flooded with comments, admiration, disbelief, and calls for accountability. The police department faced growing pressure. The officer was placed on temporary leave while an internal investigation began. The chief released a brief statement about reviewing conduct and reaffirming values of equality, but most people weren't satisfied. They wanted real change. Meanwhile, the old man stayed quiet. He spent his days tending to his small garden, feeding the stray cat that came by and avoiding the noise outside. His phone rang constantly, but he rarely answered. One afternoon, the same reporter returned with a small crew. She told him they were filming a follow-up, not about the incident, but about his life. She wanted people to see him beyond the video clip. He agreed, though reluctantly. They filmed him walking through his garden, showing the plants he'd grown from seed, talking about how he found peace in small things. "The world's full of loud voices," he said softly. "Sometimes silence grows the best fruit." She asked him what he hoped people would take from his story. He paused, then said, "I hope they learn that patience isn't weakness. It's strength in disguise." The video went viral too, not because of outrage, but because of his kindness, his calm voice, and the way he made people feel something deeper than anger. In homes across the country, families watched and talked about him. Teachers showed the video in classrooms. Community leaders quoted his words. And slowly the focus began to shift from what the officer had done wrong to what the old man had done right. But even as praise poured in, the old man stayed humble. When a neighbor told him he was a hero, he just smiled and said, "Heroes are the ones who keep trying to make things better, even when no one's watching." That night, he sat on his porch again, watching the stars. The street was quiet. Somewhere far away, he heard a siren echoing in the distance. He thought of the officer, not with anger, but with hope. Maybe this time, the lesson would last. He looked at the small flag on his porch fluttering softly in the cool night air. "Respect," he whispered, "isn't something you demand. It's something you earn by giving it first." And though he didn't know it yet, his calm words and gentle strength were changing more hearts than any argument ever could. The next few days changed everything. The story of the elderly veteran had moved beyond local headlines. Now national networks were calling him the man who answered hate with grace. Talk shows mentioned him. Online pages shared his photo beside quotes from his interview. Even strangers from other countries were leaving kind messages under the news posts. He didn't have social media, so he learned about all this from neighbors and the reporter who first visited him. She came by again to tell him that his message was touching hearts everywhere. He listened quietly, nodding from time to time. "I never meant for this to happen," he said softly. "I just wanted to live peacefully." The reporter smiled. "Maybe peace has a way of speaking louder than noise," she said. While the world admired him, inside the police department things were uneasy. The officer from that morning had been taken off duty while the department investigated the incident. He spent his days at home watching the news in silence. Every channel showed the same story: the old man's calm words, his decorated past, and the officer's harsh behavior. At first, the officer felt angry. He told himself that people didn't know the full story, that the stop had been justified. But as he kept watching the interviews, something began to change in him. The old man never once insulted him, never demanded punishment, never showed bitterness. That somehow made the officer feel even smaller. One night, unable to sleep, the officer sat on his couch watching an old news clip of the veteran's interview. The reporter asked the man, "If the officer were watching right now, what would you say to him?" The veteran looked into the camera and answered softly, "I'd tell him I forgive him, and I'd tell him to treat the next person better than he treated me. That's all." The officer muted the television. He sat there in the dark, staring at the floor. For the first time in his career, he felt ashamed, not because people were angry at him, but because the man he'd disrespected had chosen kindness instead of revenge. The next morning, the police chief called the officer into his office. "We're still reviewing the case," the chief said, "but public pressure's high. We need to handle this right." The officer nodded silently. He had no words. Meanwhile, the veteran's quiet life grew unexpectedly busy. Letters began arriving from all over the country. Thank you notes, drawings from children, and messages from other veterans who said they felt seen because of him. Some people even came by to shake his hand. though he politely said he wasn't looking for attention. He read every letter carefully, touched by the kindness of strangers. One letter came from a young man who wrote, "I was always angry at the world, but after hearing you speak I realized calm doesn't mean weak. Thank you for showing me that." The old man folded that letter and placed it beside his medals. It reminded him of why he had served in the first place, not for recognition, but to protect something good. One afternoon, the local community center invited him to speak at a gathering about respect and unity. At first he refused. "I'm no speaker," he said, but the organizer insisted that people needed to hear him in person, so he agreed. The hall was full that evening. People of all ages came, some just to listen, others to meet the man they'd seen on TV. He walked slowly to the stage, his posture straight, his steps steady. When he began to speak, the room grew quiet. "I'm not here to talk about anger," he said. "I'm here to talk about patience. We live in a world where people shout to be heard, but sometimes the quietest voices carry the most truth." He paused, looking around the room. "When that officer stopped me, I could have shouted back. I could have argued. But what would that have changed? He would have left the same and I would have lost my peace." The audience listened closely. His tone was gentle but powerful. "I've seen enough in my life to know that fighting doesn't always fix what's broken," he continued. "But kindness can reach where anger never will." When he finished, the crowd stood up and clapped. Many had tears in their eyes. The next day, clips from his speech were shared everywhere. Schools played it for their students. News programs called it a masterclass in dignity. Even the police department took notice. During a staff meeting, the chief played a short part of the speech for his officers. When it ended, he said, "This is what true strength looks like." Some of them nodded quietly. Others looked uncomfortable. The young officer sat at the back, his head down. That night he drove past the veteran's house, unsure why. The porch light was on, the small flag still fluttering softly by the steps. He thought about parking and walking up to the door, but fear held him back. Instead, he sat in his car for a few minutes, staring at the house, then drove away. A few days later, a large newspaper published an article titled, "The Man Who Changed a Town Without Raising His Voice." It talked about how the incident had sparked conversations about respect, not just in law enforcement, but in the community itself. People were volunteering more, helping one another and treating each other with newfound care. The veteran didn't see himself as the reason. People just needed a reminder, he told a friend. We all forget sometimes that we belong to each other. But deep down he felt something shifting, not just in the town but in himself too. For years he had stayed quiet about his service, believing the world had moved on. Now he realized that silence could also be a light if carried the right way. One morning as he walked to his car, he noticed a letter left on his porch. It wasn't from a stranger this time. The handwriting was shaky but careful. It read, "Sir, I owe you an apology. I was wrong in every way that day. I saw you as less when you were more than I'll ever be. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm trying to change. Thank you for your grace. You taught me something I should have already known." There was no signature, but he knew who it was from. He stood there for a long time, reading it again and again. Then he smiled faintly, folded the letter, and placed it inside the same drawer where the ticket still lay. Later that day, he went for a walk around town. People greeted him warmly. Children waved from porches. A group of teenagers stopped him for a photo, and though he wasn't used to that kind of attention, he smiled kindly and said yes. When he returned home, the reporter called him again. She told him that his story had been nominated for a national award, something about courage and humanity. He chuckled softly. "I didn't do anything brave," he said. "I just stayed calm." But to everyone else, that calm had become a symbol of strength. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, he sat on his porch again. The world felt quieter than usual. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from down the street, and for the first time in a long while, he felt peace not just inside his home, but in the air around it. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure to whom, maybe to life itself, for giving him another chance to teach without preaching, to heal without fighting. The next day, the same officer who had once humiliated him showed up at his door. His uniform was neat, his expression serious but humble. He took off his hat as he spoke. "Sir," he said quietly, "I don't expect you to talk to me, but I wanted to say I'm sorry in person." The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and motioned for the young man to sit. They sat together on the porch in silence. The air between them carried more meaning than any words could. Finally, the veteran said, "You know, everyone makes mistakes, but not everyone learns from them." The officer nodded slowly. "I'm learning," he said. "I can see that," the old man replied. "That's what matters now." They talked for nearly an hour, not about the past, but about what could change in the future, about patience, listening, and respect. When the officer left, the old man felt lighter, as if something had quietly healed. From that day on, the officer volunteered at community programs, working with young people to teach them about fairness and empathy. And whenever he passed by that small brick house on the edge of town, he slowed down, out of respect for the man who had shown him the power of forgiveness. The veteran never told anyone about that conversation. He didn't need to. He believed true change didn't need applause, only honesty and time. As the days passed, his story continued to ripple across the country. But for him, life went back to being simple: morning coffee, tending to his garden, and quiet evenings watching the sunset. He didn't want fame. What he wanted was already his: peace, and the knowledge that even one act of grace could turn a moment of hate into something that healed the world. Piece by piece, the town woke up to something it hadn't felt in years: a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. The video of the elderly man's roadside humiliation had spread faster than anyone expected. People were angry, hurt, and deeply moved. Some couldn't believe what they saw. Others said it was nothing new. But what shook everyone the most was the new discovery: that the man everyone saw being insulted was a decorated war veteran. By the next morning, local news channels picked up the story. The photo of the elderly man in uniform, younger and full of pride, flashed across TV screens and online posts. People compared it with the video of him standing helplessly beside his car while the officer yelled. The contrast was painful to watch. The same man who once stood tall for his country was treated like a nobody on a quiet street years later. At the police department, tension was thick. Reporters gathered outside, asking questions no one wanted to answer. The chief of police gave a short statement saying the department would look into the matter. But everyone knew it was more serious than that. The officer involved had been told to stay home until further notice. He watched the news in silence, his face pale, his confidence gone. He hadn't known who that man was. To him, it had been just another stop, another day of work. Now he was seeing the whole town, maybe the whole country, calling him out for disrespecting a hero. But guilt was a strange thing. It didn't come all at once. It came in slow waves. At first, he told himself people were exaggerating. Then, as he saw the veterans' interviews, something inside him started to break. The old man, meanwhile, didn't hide. When reporters came to his small house, he didn't push them away. He spoke gently, his tone steady. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," he said softly. "I've seen too much hate in my lifetime to add more of it. I just want people to learn how to treat each other better." His calmness caught everyone off guard. He didn't speak with anger or bitterness, just quiet truth. When one journalist asked him how he felt about being disrespected despite his service, he smiled faintly. "Respect isn't something you get for wearing a uniform," he replied. "It's something we owe each other as human beings. That officer didn't know me. Maybe that's the whole point. We should treat everyone with respect, whether we know who they are or not." Those words spread just as fast as the video did. People began sharing them online, quoting him in posts and articles. Within days, his story was on national news. Veterans groups reached out. People from across the country sent letters, messages, and even flowers to his doorstep. Some called him a hero again, but he didn't care for titles. He cared about the message, the lesson that still needed to be learned. At the same time, the officer who had insulted him could barely sleep. He avoided his phone. Every message from his friends felt like judgment. His family tried to comfort him, but he couldn't shake off the shame. The video replayed in his mind. His own voice shouting, his own hands searching the car. He couldn't stop thinking about the veteran's calm eyes, the quiet way he stood without fear or anger. A few days later, the town council held a meeting. The community demanded answers. People packed the hall, some furious, some heartbroken, most just confused about how something like this could still happen. The police chief stood before them, looking uneasy. He promised change, more training, and an internal review. But people wanted more than promises. They wanted accountability. Then, unexpectedly, the elderly man entered the room. The crowd fell silent as he slowly walked to the front. No one had asked him to come, but he came anyway. The police chief offered him a seat, but he preferred to stand. The officer who had humiliated him was sitting quietly in the back, almost shrinking into his chair. The old man looked around the room. "I didn't come here to demand punishment," he began. His voice was soft, but every word carried weight. "I came because I believe something good can still come out of something bad. That officer made a mistake, a painful one. But if this makes us talk, if it makes us change, then maybe it was worth it." People murmured, surprised. He continued, "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. I served my country believing that everyone deserves dignity. That hasn't changed. I just hope others start to believe it too." The officer in the back felt his throat tighten. He couldn't sit still anymore. Slowly he stood up, his hands shaking. "Sir," he said, his voice trembling, "I don't have an excuse. I was wrong. I treated you unfairly. I didn't see you for who you are. I'm ashamed of what I did." The room was still. The old man turned to look at him. For a moment their eyes met, one filled with guilt, the other with quiet strength. "What's your name, son?" the old man asked. The officer told him. "All right," the man said softly. "Now what matters isn't what you said to me that day. It's what you'll say to the next person you meet who looks like me. That's how we change things. One person at a time." The officer nodded, unable to speak. Tears filled his eyes. The crowd, moved by the exchange, began to clap slowly. Not out of celebration, but out of deep respect for the man's grace. After the meeting, reporters tried to interview both men again, but the old man refused. He said what needed to be said was already out there. He just wanted life to go on. The officer, on the other hand, stayed behind after everyone left. He asked the police chief for a chance to meet the veteran privately. The next day, he went to the small house at the edge of town. He stood at the door, nervous. When it opened, the old man smiled faintly, as if he'd been expecting him. The officer apologized again, this time without cameras or witnesses. He spoke about how much he'd learned in just a few days, how ashamed he was of his assumptions, how he wanted to be better. The old man listened quietly, then said, "Guilt won't change the past, but understanding can change the future. You have a choice now. Keep regretting or start doing right." That moment changed everything for the officer. He began volunteering at local schools, talking to kids about respect, about prejudice, and about the power of kindness. He worked with community groups and took diversity training seriously. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because he finally understood. As for the veteran, life slowly returned to normal. He still took morning walks, still stopped by the cafe for his black coffee, still waved at his neighbors. But people now greeted him differently, not out of pity but out of deep admiration. They respected his quiet dignity, his refusal to hate. Months later, he was invited to a local ceremony where the mayor wanted to honor him for his service and his example. He accepted, but when he stood at the podium, he didn't talk about the incident. He talked about forgiveness. "When we carry hate," he said, "it only makes the world heavier. But when we choose grace, we make it lighter for everyone." The room stood silent before breaking into applause. Even the officer was there, standing in the back, his eyes shining with emotion. That day, the story wasn't just about racism or injustice anymore. It was about transformation. How one painful moment could open the door to something better. It reminded people that change doesn't always start in big cities or powerful offices. Sometimes it starts on a quiet road between two people who finally learn to see each other as equals. When the ceremony ended, the veteran stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky was fading into soft shades of orange and purple. He looked at the flag fluttering gently in the distance and smiled. He didn't need medals or speeches. He'd already won something greater, peace in his heart. He adjusted his old cap and began walking home, his steps steady, his spirit unshaken. And though he never said it out loud, deep down, he hoped that somewhere someone would hear his story and remember. Respect isn't a reward, it's a way of life. Weeks turned into months, and life in the small town slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The roads were still the same. The people still nodded politely when passing by. But something deep inside the community had changed. The story of the elderly veteran and the officer had left a mark, one that would not fade easily. The veteran, as always, remained humble. He didn't talk much about what happened. To him, it wasn't about being famous or being called a hero again. He didn't want his last years to be about a single bad day. He wanted them to be about peace, about showing that kindness could still exist in a world that often forgot it. Every morning he followed the same routine. He'd wake up early, brew his coffee, and sit by the small wooden table near the window. The sunlight would touch his face, and he'd quietly hum the same old tune he used to whistle back in his army days. Sometimes he'd smile to himself, remembering the faces of those he had served with. Some gone, some still out there somewhere, living their own stories. But something new had started to happen. Letters began arriving, not just from his town but from across the country. Some were handwritten, some typed, but all filled with words of gratitude. People thanked him for showing grace instead of anger. Some said his story made them see the world differently. A few even said they apologized to people they'd treated unfairly because of him. He read every letter carefully, sometimes twice. It touched him to know that something good had come out of such an unpleasant day. He often said to himself, maybe that was the reason it happened. Maybe it was meant to teach more than just one man. Meanwhile, the officer's life had also changed, though in a very different way. He had become quieter, more thoughtful. The loud, confident attitude he once carried was gone. He started attending community events, volunteering with local veterans groups, and spending his weekends helping out in schools. He spoke to teenagers about responsibility, prejudice, and learning to see people as individuals. At first, people were skeptical. They thought he was just trying to fix his image. But over time, they saw it wasn't for show. He meant it. He didn't speak about the incident much, but when he did, he owned up to it fully. He said it was the worst day of his life, not because of the backlash, but because it forced him to see the person he had become. One evening, the officer visited the veteran again. He had no cameras, no reporters, no one watching, just him. The old man was sitting on his porch reading one of his many letters. When he saw the officer, he smiled gently. "You've been busy," he said. The younger man nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and respect. "Trying to make up for things," he said softly. The veteran shook his head. "You can't make up for the past," he replied. "But you can make it matter. And I think that's what you're doing." They sat quietly for a while, just listening to the crickets and the soft rustle of the evening breeze. The officer finally said, "I didn't understand before. I thought authority was about control. I thought wearing a uniform made me better than others. But that day, you didn't fight me, you didn't yell. You just stood there calm. That calmness hit me harder than anything." The old man smiled faintly. "Sometimes silence teaches louder than shouting," he said. "Anger closes doors. Understanding opens them." The officer nodded. "I'm learning that now," he said. "And I want to thank you for not giving up on me that day, even when you had every reason to." The veteran leaned back, looking up at the darkening sky. "Son," he said quietly, "we're all students of life. Some lessons come easy, some hurt. But if you learned something from that day, then it wasn't wasted." That conversation stayed with the officer. It became the turning point in his journey. From that day, he made a promise to live differently. He trained new recruits in empathy and respect, telling them, "Every person you stop has a story you don't know. Treat them like you'd treat your own father or mother." The department noticed the change in him. Over time, he became one of the most respected officers in the town, not because of his authority, but because of his humanity. Even people who had once been angry with him now greeted him with a nod. Redemption had come quietly, not through words, but through consistent actions. As for the veteran, he continued to live simply. But he became a quiet symbol of wisdom in the community. Schools began inviting him to speak at assemblies. He would sit in front of a group of young faces and tell them stories, not about war, but about life. He talked about patience, about how pride can destroy kindness, and how forgiveness can rebuild what anger breaks. He told them that being strong wasn't about fighting harder. It was about standing tall without hate in your heart. The students always listened closely,